Hi, I'm Joey DiGuglielmo. I'm the features editor at Washington Blade. And on the occasion of our 50th anniversary, we're taking a few minutes today to talk to our longest veteran staff members. Here we have Lou Jabaro, Phil Rockstro, and Lynn Brown. And we're going to have a conversation about how they got involved with the paper and a little bit about their memories of their experience at Washington Blade over 50 years. So we'd like to start off by asking each of you, we can just go down the line, how did you first even hear of the Blade? How did you first know there was such a thing?
Well, I moved to Washington in 1972, but was not out yet as a gay person and knew virtually nothing about the LGBT community. But coming from New York, when I was ready to come out around 1975 or so, 74, I saw an ad in the Village Voice, and it had a advertisement for a gay counseling center in New York. So on my next trip, since my family is in New York, I went there and visited this person, and he gave me not only the ins and outs of New York, but Washington, and told me about the Washington Blade. He said it would be a good resource for you. So as soon as I returned to Washington, I immediately found it and started reading the Blade, and that's how I first learned about it.
And do you recall there being an LGBT paper in New York at the time?
There was. I didn't know about it at the time, but yes, there was.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And tell us your title, Lou. What's your title now, and what was your title when you started at the Blade?
Well, my title now is senior news reporter, and I don't know if we had titles. Officially, I was a reporter. Mm-hmm. Started, of course, as a freelancer, and then eventually went on the staff.
Okay, we'll get to that timeline in a minute. All right, how did you first even know the Blade was the thing, Phil?
I was working out of Indianapolis for the Hardware Association, and I traveled all over the country doing research. And in doing that research, every town that I went to, I looked for a gay newspaper. And I found, when I saw the Blade, I was like, wow, this is really a newspaper. It's not a bar rag, which is what I was accustomed to seeing in Indianapolis. Mm-hmm. And it was, I don't know, in 1980, early 1986, a friend of mine that had just moved here said, Phil, the Washington Blade is hiring. That would be perfect for you. And so I came out and applied, and here I am.
What position did you apply for?
Sales rep.
Okay. All right. Lynn?
And what are you today?
Oh, and what am I today? I handle accounts receivables, classified advertising, credit card processing, and I try to do anything else that they need done in the office.
Mm-hmm. What year did you move to Washington?
1986.
86. Okay. Ms. Brown?
Well, thank you. In 1973, I started at Syracuse University and read Off Our Backs at the Women's Center. It was a newspaper published here in Washington, D.C. A few years later, as I graduated and looked for a place to live, I came to Washington because of a newspaper, but not the Washington Blade. I read the Blade, I saw the Blade, and used the Blade in one failed courtship where classifieds played a critical role. Moved away for a brief bit of time and subscribed to the Blade, and I mention that because when I interviewed at the Washington Blade for a sales position, I think the thing that cinched it, there were two things the publisher liked about me. Well, I could expand, I suppose, but I don't want to speak for him. I was a long-haired lesbian who didn't really scare him, and I had a dog instead of a cat. And when I said I had been reading the Blade while in San Diego on graduate work, he didn't believe me and got up and went and checked his own subscription list. And lo and behold, I was telling him the truth. Mm. I'm not sure if it was the subscription that cinched it for him, or if it was the fact that he'd found a salesperson who would not lie to him, who was honest. But that was somewhere like 1987, 88, and I was indeed a junior account executive to Philip. He taught me everything I know. And today is a whole other is a whole other story. Where I am today at the Blade is just a different and frightening story altogether.
Do we want to get into that or get into that eventually?
Not too much, but through a series of career changes, I managed to learn enough about running a newspaper that when the Blade was put out of business by previous owners, that annoyed almost everyone here in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And we were the team that could do it, and we became the team that does it today.
So officially your title now is?
Publisher.
Publisher.
In
Mm-hmm.
Washington.
All right, I knew that, but I just wanted to hear
thank
you
you.
say it.
I can say it.
All right. And so we kind of touched on this a little bit already, but you were talking about Lou when you went to, start as a contributor. So how long was it after you had been reading the paper and were aware of the paper that you realized there was the opportunity to do some writing?
I think it started, I'm trying to remember, well, I believe it was 1976 when I started as a freelancer.
Mm-hmm.
Initially it was...
So you've been reading for a few years before that?
Yes, I had, and...
Did you have any recollection of thinking that it was a quality paper, or did you rely on it as a news source? What was your sort of interest as a reader?
Well, I was clearly interested as someone who was new to the gay scene, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I was certainly interested in what was going on. I've always been interested in politics. I was working as a reporter for a small newsletter publication focusing on energy and the environment. That was actually my background, going back to school, covering environmental issues. And, but as a gay person, I was certainly interested in the political situation in Washington and the LGBT community.
Mm-hmm.
So that made me very much interested in the Blade. But I started, prior to writing for the Blade, doing a little writing and broadcasting actually for a gay radio program that had started in Washington some years earlier called Friends. And I wrote some news for them. And it was a weekly program out of Georgetown University. And at one point, the church hierarchy realized that the radio station was including some content, including a gay program that they thought was at odds with the church, so they shut down the radio station.
Mm.
And when that happened, I looked for another outlet. I was interested in gay news, and then went to the Blade and began doing freelancing.
So how did you initially make contact? Did they post an ad that they were looking for contributors, or did you just blind call, or what happened?
I think I just visited the office because if I recall correctly, and Lynn may remember this, but they were in a building, I believe on 19th Street near DuPont Circle, on the second floor above where Lambda Rising originally was, the gay bookstore, LGBT bookstore in DC, and another little business, a head shop as it was known as, called Earthworks, in this little building. It's a townhouse, but it was converted into offices, and the Blade was in that building, so I had been in the building to go to the bookstore, Lambda Rising, and one day just walked upstairs to the Blade office and met the editor at the time and told him that I was interested, and that's how it began.
And do you recall that individual's name?
He went by the name, like so many back then, it was in the mid-70s, Christian DeForest. I believe his actual name, he worked for the government. He actually worked for the Defense Department and had to be cautious about his own name, but...
So he did the Blade work on the side?
Yes.
Okay. And are you at liberty to say his real name?
Yes, sadly he's no longer with us.
Okay.
I mean, he was one of those, like so many, that fell from AIDS, but his name was Chris Crislip, I believe.
Okay. And what was your impression? Was it sort of a fledgling operation of volunteers, or did they pay contributors at the time, or what was the mood in the office like when you first started just contributing?
Yeah, it was informal. There were a few volunteer photographers and a few writers. There was the editor. Christian was actually the editor and acted as the publisher.
Okay.
And it was informal. I believe when I first started, it was volunteer, I believe. And as the Blade went along, it was continuing to grow. And they then they paid freelancers as well.
And was it still a monthly at that point?
Yes.
Still monthly, okay. And do you recall if any of the founders were still involved? Was Nancy Tucker or Lily Vincennes or anybody like that still involved in any capacity to your knowledge?
No, they were talked about, but
Okay.
I don't believe they were there when I first came in.
And what sorts of pieces did you do when you were contributing at first?
I was writing about local politics. It was 1976. It was a presidential election. And I guess my first scoop, as one might say, was brought to my attention by someone who's still around so many years later, Paul Kunstler, who was a gay Democratic activist. And he gave me a tip, which was ultimately put on the front page of the Blade, where there was a plan by LGBT delegates at the 1976 Democratic Convention to nominate a gay person for president. And they didn't expect, of course, anybody would be nominated, but it would give an opportunity for the person to speak on the platform of the Democratic National Convention. So I wrote about that, and ultimately it turned out that that was vetoed by the gay leaders at the convention. They didn't want to offend then Governor Jimmy Carter, but it was something that created a lot of attention.
Okay. And I understand you were writing under a pseudonym, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
What was your pseudonym?
The pseudonym I kept, my ethnicity was Lou Romano.
And how did you come up with that?
I'm trying to remember how I came up with it. I guess it was a name that just sounded like an easy Italian-American name. And it was because, like many of us back then, it was uncertain. I was a volunteer starting at the Blade and then a freelancer, but it was unclear whether using your real name might lead to ramifications that could prevent future employment.
Okay. And were you out in your personal life? I imagine you were to some degree at that point?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And what were you living on? What was your income at this time?
I was doing freelancing from the Blade. I'm trying to remember. I believe when I first started, I was employed full-time, with another newsletter company. It was called Trends Publishing at the time, and that was, as I mentioned, I was writing about energy and environment type issues, covering the Environmental Protection Agency and that sort of thing.
Did you have any interaction with any of the other Blade contributors? Did you socialize at all, or did you have reason to come into the office to do your stories, or did you submit them? How did it work?
I think it was a little bit of both. The freelancers did most of the stories at home, but thinking back in those days, the pre-word processor, pre-computerized digital era, there were manual typewriters, of course.
Sure. Did you know any of the other contributors?
I knew a few. I'm trying to remember who they might be now. Some of them stayed on a number of years.
And did you and Chris have a good working relationship?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Phil, can you elaborate a little bit on what you were talking about earlier about how you came on board, and tell us a little bit about what your early experiences were like at the Blade in '87 and '88, '89, all through there.
So I moved to Washington in 1986. It was I think April 6th was my first issue. And at the time, I was, I think we were 24 pages, maybe 32 on average. And a woman by the name of Shannon Rhodes was the sales manager, and she was really a strong, excited woman that encouraged me to go out and drum up business. It was that year at Pride, our Pride guide, I think, was 80 pages. And I hadn't told my parents that I was working for a gay newspaper when I moved here. So I ended up, after Pride, for the 4th of July, I took the Pride guide and the paper home. and left it on the dining room table for my parents to see. And when my dad looked at it, he was like, "You didn't tell us this." And I said, "Well, no, but I'm telling you now." And he said, "But you'll never be able to get a real job ever." And I was like, "Well, okay, Dad, I'm sorry you think that way." It was probably 5 or 6 years later when he changed his mind on that.
Had that been even a slight concern in the back of your mind when you first applied?
I don't think so. You know, I think the opportunity seemed immense at the time. You know, we didn't have fax machines then, so as far as operating in the business, I would bring an ad or notes in from a client, put those all down on paper, give them to the production department that would typeset, type, and pull images and do it all by hand. And then I had to take a proof back to the client by hand.
So logistically, I mean, all the legwork, how did you ever get a paper out? Were there more people doing it than there are now? Or, I mean, I can't imagine just the legwork.
I think my recollection is that maybe there were 16 people at that time. I don't
16 on staff total?
Total.
Okay.
You know, I'm sure there were freelancers that I didn't know about.
Sure.
Lou was an employee at that time.
Sure.
So it was just so different. I mean, I think it was like 4 or 5 years before we actually got computers in the office. And that was a big step too. We still weren't emailing proofs, but we could manage account databases then and everything.
And where was the office located when you first came on?
930 F Street. The 930 Club was downstairs and we were upstairs.
So was that loud, or were you all still working more daytime and that was concerts at nighttime?
There would be nighttime shift. I mean, you know, if the paper wasn't done, we were there working and it would be loud.
Yeah.
Or louder, but you know, now we sit next to construction zones, so.
Which is why we're here. All right. Okay. And do you remember meeting Lou as soon as you started? I imagine you met all the staff fairly early.
Yeah, I think I was took around. They took me around and introduced me to everybody. And at the time, you know, wow. I think I was just in shock of where I was and what I was doing.
And were you fully out in your personal life at that time? And had you been for a while?
I had been out. I came out to my family in 1976. And gradually, so about the time you started at the paper, thank you, Lou. I gradually then came out to the rest of the world over time. I would be walking down the street going to lunch, though, and somebody would yell out of their car, "Hey, faggots!" That just totally blows me away today that we would hear that. Although 10 years ago in Fort Wayne, Indiana, I was driving my dad's car through town and
Somebody yelled, "Hey, faggot."
somebody yelled, "Hey, faggot." I couldn't figure out how they knew I was a faggot just sitting in my dad's car.
Yeah.
So my response today is different too, though. You know, it's yeah.
That's Mr. Faggot.
Then I was afraid. I'm not afraid anymore, I guess, about that one.